Alan Turing gets the movie. He gets Benedict Cumberbatch. He gets statues. He gets his face on money. He gets his face on a stamp. Millions of people can tell you his name, his story, and how he supposedly helped win the war. Now, let me tell you about the woman who broke the Japanese Naval Code a decade before World War II even started. She trained half the men who cracked the codes that won the Pacific War. The NSA's own declassified files describe her as possibly the greatest cryptanalyst in American history. She has never been in a film, no statue, no stamp. Most people alive today have never once heard her name. My name was Agnes Meyer Driscoll, and this is how I disappeared from a war I helped win. I joined the Navy in 1918, the first year women were even allowed to enlist. I wasn't hired to break codes. Almost nobody was back then. The field barely existed as a profession. I was hired because I was good with numbers, good with languages, and good at noticing when something didn't fit a pattern. That last part turned out to be the whole job. Before the Navy, I taught mathematics and music at a small college in Texas. That might sound like an odd starting point for a career spent breaking enemy ciphers, but it wasn't. Music theory is pattern and structure dressed up as art. Mathematics is pattern and structure dressed up as logic. Code breaking, it turns out, is the same discipline wearing a uniform. I didn't know that yet when I enlisted. I just knew I was tired of being underestimated in rooms full of men who assumed a woman's mind worked in straight lines instead of systems. By the 1920s, I was working for the Navy's tiny, underfunded codebreaking unit, the kind of office that existed in the space between budget lines. We didn't have the resources of a national code-breaking center. We had a handful of desks, a lot of coffee, and thousands of pages of intercepted enemy communication that looked to everyone else like meaningless noise. The work was slow in a way that doesn't translate well in film. There were no montages. There were weeks where nothing broke. There were months where a single insight, one repeated letter grouping, one operator's careless habit was the only thing separating progress from another year of static. Code breaking rewards patience more than brilliance, and it punishes anyone looking for a shortcut. I learned early that the people who lasted in that room weren't the fastest thinkers. They were the ones who could stare at failure for 6 months without flinching. I broke Japanese diplomatic and naval codes before most Americans had ever heard the word cryptanalyst. I worked on breaking German codes too. But the work that would matter most, the work almost nobody remembers, was still ahead of me. In the early 1930s, the Imperial Japanese Navy started using a new cipher machine for its most sensitive communications. The Americans called it the M1. It was mechanical, it rotated its settings with every letter typed, and it was built specifically so that nobody outside Japan could ever read what passed through it. Naval intelligence considered it, quietly, unbreakable. I didn't have the machine, I didn't have a defector, I didn't have a captured manual. What I had was paper. Thousands of pages of scrambled Japanese naval text, and the belief that even a machine built to hide patterns still has to produce them, because somewhere behind the gears, there's still a human being encoding a message the same way, over and over, without realizing it. That's the part people don't understand about code breaking. It isn't a flash of genius, it's obsession. It's reading the same wall of nonsense for the 200th time, and noticing that one specific shape of nonsense keeps almost repeating. I spent years on that machine, years of building statistical tables by hand, tracking which letter combinations showed up more often than pure chance would allow, testing theories that failed and starting over without anyone telling me to. There was no guarantee any of it would work. Nobody above me could promise the M1 was breakable at all. For all any of us knew, the Japanese Navy had finally built something that would stay dark forever. I kept working anyway, because the alternative was deciding in advance that I'd already lost, and I have never been able to do that. I broke it, the M1, the machine the Japanese Navy trusted with its most secret communications, years before the war that would make that code matter more than anyone in that little office could imagine. There was no ticking bomb, no control room, no one shouting my name across a war room, just a woman, a desk, and a decade nobody was watching. Here's the part of the story that actually changes the outcome of a war. I didn't just break codes. I taught the next generation how to break them. Officers came through that Navy cryptanalysis unit and learned the discipline, the pattern recognition, the statistical thinking, the sheer stubborn patience from watching how I worked, and in some cases, sitting in classes I ran. Some of those officers went on to Station HY in Haipo. Some went to Station CAST in the Philippines. Those were the units that in 1942 broke into JN-25, the main operational code of the Japanese Navy. JN-25 is the code that American commanders used to know where the Japanese fleet was heading in the spring of 1942. That intelligence is a direct reason the U.S. Navy was waiting at Midway instead of getting ambushed by it. Midway is the battle historians point to as the turning point of the entire Pacific War. I'm not going to stand here and tell you I personally broke JN-25 myself, alone, with my own two hands. That's not how intelligence work functions, and it's not how I want to be remembered, as a myth instead of a person. What I will tell you is this. The people in those rooms doing that work learned the craft from someone, and a significant number of them learned it from me. You don't get to erase the teacher and keep the lesson. Some of those officers went on to write their own chapters in the history books. A few of them are remembered today as legends of American cryptology, credited by name in documentaries and memoirs, quoted in books about the codebreakers who won the Pacific War. I don't say that with bitterness. I'm proud of what they did. I'm proud that the discipline I tried to instill, check your assumptions, distrust your first answer, let the pattern find you instead of forcing one onto the data, carried forward into rooms I was never even in. But there's a particular kind of erasure that happens to teachers. The student's success becomes proof of the student's genius full stop, with no line drawn backward to where that genius was built. Nobody asks who taught the codebreaker how to break codes. The question just doesn't occur to most people because we like our history simple. One brilliant mind, one breakthrough, one statue. Not a chain of desks stretching back through a career nobody bothered to record. Here's where the story turns from remarkable to infuriating. Everything I worked on was classified. That's normal for intelligence work. I understood that. I accepted that. I lived my whole career inside that silence. What I didn't expect was for the silence to outlast the war by 80 years. While Turing's work eventually became public, became celebrated, became cinema, mine stayed buried in vaults, reviewed decade after decade, released in fragments, most of it decades after I had already died in obscurity. When the National Security Agency finally started declassifying documents about the history of American cryptology, my name started appearing, described in the agency's own internal historical assessments in language reserved for almost nobody else in the field. Words like brilliant, words like one of the greatest. Read that again. The government's own historians, writing for other government historians decades after I was gone, used language like that to describe me in documents nobody outside the intelligence community was ever meant to see. And still, no film, no statue, no plaque outside a Navy building, barely a paragraph in most histories of the war. Some of this is just how classified work operates. The people who do the most sensitive intelligence work are, by design, supposed to stay invisible. That part isn't unique to me. Most great crypto analysts, male or female, don't get statues because the entire discipline runs on secrecy outliving the secret keeper. But there's also this. In the culture of that era, and honestly for a long time after it, the story the country wanted to tell about the war was a story about men in uniform on ships and beaches. A woman sitting at a desk for 20 years, quietly outthinking an empire's naval intelligence didn't fit the poster. Turing's story eventually broke through because it became a story about persecution and injustice that a nation had to publicly reckon with. Mine stayed a story about paperwork nobody outside a three-letter agency ever had a reason to open. Different silence, same disappearance. There's another piece of this worth saying plainly because it's uncomfortable and it's true. For years after my most important work, some of the men around me got promoted past me, credited over me, and remembered instead of me. Not always because their work outweighed mine, but because it was easier for the institution to build its story around them. I don't say this to relitigate old grievances. I say this because if we only tell the tidy version of this story, brilliant woman, unfair world, quietly accepted her fate, we let the institution off the hook for choices it actively made. Somebody decided whose names went in the official histories drafted right after the war. Somebody decided which files got prioritized for declassification decades later. Those weren't accidents. They were the ordinary, unremarkable decisions that erase people a little at a time, made by people who probably never once thought of themselves as erasing anyone. I'm not telling you this story so you feel bad for a woman who's been dead for decades. I'm telling you this because the pattern didn't stop with me. Right now, in intelligence agencies, in cybersecurity firms, in research labs, there are people doing work exactly like mine, invisible by design, uncredited by culture, essential by necessity. Some of them will spend entire careers making other people's victories possible and never get their name on the wall. History isn't just what happened, it's who somebody decided to remember writing it down. I broke the unbreakable code. I trained the men who won the Pacific. And for 80 years, that was a secret even from the people it belonged to. Now, you know it too. Agnes Meyer Driscoll, 1889 to 1971. Look her up. If this is the first time you've heard her name, that was the whole point of this video. Tell me in the comments who else you think history left out of the frame. And if you want the next hidden codebreaker story, subscribe, because there are a lot more names history forgot to put on the wall.